From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, and welcome to the main event, the last program of the evening here in the ballroom. My name is Ron Elving. I am an editor-correspondent podcaster at NPR, and also a full-time, thank you, and also a full-time faculty member at American University's School of Public Affairs. It is my very great pleasure to be here this evening with John Aloysius Farrell, Jack Farrell to his friends, and he has written his third book. His first book was called Clarence Darrow, Attorney for the Damned. Now, I think you should buy that book just for the title. His second book was called Tip O'Neill and the Democratic Century. And then he turned to Richard Nixon, The Life. Jack,
because he's such a popular character.
Jack, because of that trajectory, I have to ask, what made you turn to Dick Nixon?
I was drawn to his story. The original subtitle for the book was Richard Nixon, An American Tragedy. And I was struck as I did the research that people like Henry Kissinger and Elliot Richardson would write in their diaries or talk on the phone with each other. And as Watergate was collapsing around him, they would say, you know, this is really like classic Greek tragedy. This is really a Shakespearean scene of someone who has so many gifts, and yet this amazing tragic flaw which ended up bringing him down in quite a Shakespearean manner. He was Iago to his own Othello. He was always whispering in his own ear, "You're not good enough. They hate you. They're against me." And in the end, it destroyed him. And he had that one final moment of recognition. Some of you may remember on the last day that he was in the White House when he addressed his staff and family in the East Room, and he said, remember, others may hate you, but if you hate them, then you destroy yourself. And so there's this wonderful moment of self-recognition when he sees that the tragic flaw has brought him down in just the way that he feared the most, and yet in the end that's what got him.
I'm struck by your comparison to Iago to his own Othello. I don't believe that line is in the book. I think you have said it on another occasion, but I have looked for it in the book, and I don't believe I found it. Is that something that you have thought of since writing the book, and what does it mean to you?
No, actually, when you write a proposal for a book, you sort of try to come up with analogies to what this story is. And when I wrote the proposal for Doubleday, that was in the proposal. I didn't use it in the book. I probably should have, because as I went back and prepared to go out on the book tour, I came across that line. I said, yeah, this is a pretty good line, and I've used it. But if you remember the play, Othello is this great general, and Iago, his lieutenant, is very jealous of him and starts whispering in his ear, and Iago puts this paranoia in Othello. And in the end, Othello ends up killing his beautiful wife Desdemona because of Iago was so good at doing that. So Nixon always had this susceptibility of telling himself over and over again, I'm not good enough. And one of the most heartrending examples of this is when he comes back from China and he's accomplished everything that he wanted to do in his life. He's become president against all these odds, come from the backwoods of California to become president of the United States. He wants to be a great man, and he sees this opportunity in the Cold War to drive a wedge between Red China and the Soviet Union and to bring China into the family of nations. And long before he was president, he wrote about this in an article in Foreign Affairs magazine, talking about how this new century was going to be a century of an information age. This is Richard Nixon in 1965. An information age dominated by computers, and that the old communist monolithic societies would not be able to compete with the nimbleness of science that's going to be needed in the 21st century. So he sees this happening as he's president. He goes to China. He makes this amazing breakthrough, and he comes back, and he's talking to Henry Kissinger on one of the infamous White House tapes, and Iago starts to whisper. And he says, you know, Henry, the American people are a bunch of sheep. They watched me on television with all that handshaking and stuff in China, and you and I know it really doesn't mean a thing. And this is Richard Nixon not really being cynical about the American people, but bad-mouthing himself because he had such a sense of inferiority. So that's where I should have used it in the book. It is a good line.
And then you mentioned that Foreign Affairs piece from 1965, in which he seemed to have an enormous amount of sophistication about Asia. And in the book, you point out that he had toured Asia as vice president, part of his duties for Dwight Eisenhower, and that he'd learned a great deal and impressed a lot of people. He seemed to have really taken that on as a study through much of the rest of his life. But one of the things about the book that got attention as soon as it came out was you broke a bit of news that had to do with the Asian land war that everyone knew we shouldn't try to fight, but Richard Nixon found us fighting when he became president in Vietnam, of course. And the news that you broke had to do with a person named Anna Chennault, famous to perhaps our generation before us, but not so well known today, who was sent on a mission by the, if you will, Nixon White House in waiting before he was elected president, when he was still a private citizen, but the nominee of the Republican Party. What was that all about?
Well, it's almost 50 years. It'll be 50 years next year. Nixon was running in 1968, an amazing year of turbulence, the year that Bob Kennedy and Martin Luther King were assassinated, and you had Eugene McCarthy challenging LBJ in New Hampshire. You had riots at the Democratic Convention. And in the midst of all this, Richard Nixon builds a pretty formidable lead by September of 1968 over his Democratic opponent, Hubert Humphrey, because Lyndon Johnson, the sitting president, has announced that he's not going to run for re-election because of Vietnam. And then all of a sudden, the Democratic Party starts, the Democratic voters start coming home in the fall of 1968. And the blue-collar union workers, they leave George Wallace, who was running as a third-party candidate, and they start going back to the Democratic Party. The Eugene McCarthy anti-war folks start forgiving Humphrey because he does a little bit of a tiptoe towards a split with LBJ on Vietnam. And all of a sudden, at the beginning of September, Richard Nixon had this young guy who was a vote counter, and his name was Alan Greenspan.
Good counter.
Yeah, and Alan Greenspan sends him a memo and says, we're going to win 410 electoral votes. Humphrey will be lucky if he wins a single state because Wallace will take the rest. But it has closed dramatically by the middle of September. And then Lyndon Johnson calls Nixon in and says, we're seeing some progress on Vietnam. I may institute a bombing halt. Now, Richard Nixon thought that he had lost the 1960 election because the Kennedys stole it from him. And he had seen Johnson in 1966 do an October surprise in the off-year congressional elections by announcing that he was closer to peace in Vietnam. So Nixon's paranoia kicks in, and he sees these forces lined up against him, ready to steal something from him once again. And he uses this connection, a woman named Anna Chennault, who was very well known in the palaces of Asia because her husband, Claire Chennault, had led the Flying Tigers into battle against the Japanese in World War II. And he sends her to the South Vietnamese to tell them that if they can just hold on a little bit longer, Nixon will be elected and you'll get a better deal. And so rather than go to Paris and join in the peace talks, which Nixon thinks is a charade, the South Vietnamese resist. They don't join in the peace talks. Now, this was pretty much a known story because at some point that fall, Lyndon Johnson got wind of it. And he sent the FBI out to tail and to tap the tapes, they always come back, to tail and to tap the Republican, Claire Chennault, the Republican envoy, Mrs. Anna Chennault, the Republican envoy, and the South Vietnamese embassy, and the presidential palace in Saigon. So Johnson is getting all this information in. He sees what's happening. He gets on the phone call with Republican senators like Everett Dirksen, and he says, I'm reading their hand, Everett, and this is darn near treason. So he confronts Nixon, and Nixon denies it, but it has actually happened. And the great tragedy of this story is that there really was a peace feeler from the Soviet Union to Johnson that summer. And the Soviets said, if you'll do a bombing halt, we can promise that there will be productive talks. We'll get the North Vietnamese to the table. So what Nixon saw as a dirty trick, Johnson actually believed was a chance to end the war earlier. But Nixon intercedes, and the South Vietnamese pull back, and the peace talks don't happen, and Nixon is elected in one of the closest elections in American history. It's
43% of the vote.
43, with only 43% of the vote. So elements of this story come out over the years, but Nixon always denied it. And if you go back and watch the famous Frost-Nixon interviews, David Frost asks him specifically, did you send Anna Chanel to talk to the South Vietnamese? And Nixon says, no, I would never do something like that. So the last big piece of the puzzle, and the piece that confronted Lyndon Johnson in 1968, was whether Richard Nixon had been directly involved. And as I'm going through this vast amount of material that's been released in the last 20 years at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, there are handwritten notes by Nixon's chief of staff, a man named H.R. Haldeman, Bob Haldeman. And he's writing down what Nixon is telling him. And Nixon is saying, keep Anna Chanel working on the South Vietnamese. Any way we can monkey wrench Johnson's initiative.
And monkey wrench, of course, meant?
Throw a monkey wrench into the gears and stop it. So that was my little contribution to history. History sometimes is like a rainy day like today, you're down at the beach and you pull out a jigsaw puzzle because there's nothing else to do, and you start putting the puzzle pieces together. And then the sun comes out and you go away, but your brother-in-law comes up behind you and he starts putting a few pieces of the puzzle together. And eventually the puzzle gets assembled. And so that was my little piece of the puzzle. I was glad to contribute to history.
And a crucial piece it is. One of the things that strikes me about your book, and I think has struck others as well and reviewers as well, has been the extraordinary way that you managed to remain dispassionate and yet have a sort of edge on the seat involvement in what's going on. Now, you did not live all of this history even, but I think a lot
Sadly,
of it,
I lived some of it.
So many of us have lived much of it.
Yeah.
And I think for our generation, I read the book feeling as though I was reliving my life. Did you feel that way at all when you were going back through this? Did you feel personally involved in these events, the larger events, if not the specific events of Richard Nixon's life?
I was a little bit torn. I was in college during Watergate. So I wasn't in college at the time of the great Vietnam protests, and yet, you know, Nixon was a bad guy for people of my generation. And so when I started to go into his life, I approached it as a biographer, which is, you know, telling myself, all right, you have to be objective, you have to be fair, you have to look at this guy dispassionately and see it from his point of view. And what I found as I looked into Nixon's life was that my sympathy, my empathy for him grew, even as I was finding things out about Watergate or this about Vietnam, which I thought was a horribly, horribly cynical act. I was looking at where he came from and what he had to do to get to where he was. He was born in the California outback, as I said, and his father was a blowhard, somewhat abusive. He managed to be someone who could fail to grow lemons in Orange County, which was one of the most bountiful citrus belts in the world. And he took it out on his sons. And he had 5 sons, and 2 of them died in Nixon's childhood. His baby brother Arthur died in like a week, shocking the family of meningitis. And then his older brother Harold, who was the golden boy of the family, contracted tuberculosis and died over a period of 6 years that wasted the family's finances. So, so by this point, they had sold the lemon farm. They had moved to a crossroads outside of Whittier, and his father bought an abandoned church and had it toted down the road and put on this corner and opened a grocery store and began to sell groceries out of this abandoned church. And Dick's job was to drive into Los Angeles to the markets at 3 a.m. and get the produce and bring it back to the store and polish it and prepare it and then go off to school. And he did this while trying to maintain a lot of extracurricular activities, drama, football, debate, and he was very successful, very bright individual. But all the time knowing that the good kids inside Whittier, the kids on in the sort of the garden side of this town, looked down on him because of his family situation. So he was always had this resentment, but at the same time this amazing drive and resilience. If there's anything about Dick Nixon to admire, it's the resilience, the ability to pick himself up, and even in the last years of his life after Watergate, to mount a semi-successful comeback, at least public relations-wise, until he appears on the cover of Newsweek magazine with the big headline, "He's back." So.
And Nixon's the one. And Nixon won, as you said, in 1968. 43% or not, he won the Electoral College because it was a three-way vote with George Wallace and Hubert Humphrey. So then he is president, and he does continue the Vietnam War, but we get changes in the way the draft works, and we start to Vietnamize the war more aggressively. And people kind of step back a little bit. College campuses get a little cooler. Not so much after the Cambodia invasion in 1970, but you know what I'm talking about. In general, he de-escalated and moved us towards an American withdrawal, which eventually would happen. But he also did a lot of other things, especially in that first term, which stand to surprise people who don't remember those years. I'm going to refer to a few of them. He expanded Social Security benefits, the EPA Act that he signed, OSHA, the Safety and Occupational Health Administration, Title IX for women athletes. He had a health care proposal you write about in the book that was amazingly like what we now think of as Obamacare.
Very close to what we see as Obamacare. His administration pioneered the idea that we should, rather than go to a single-payer system, rather than Medicare for all, rather than a Canadian or a European type system, that we should just tell the insurance companies that, tell the American companies that everybody's got to have insurance. We're going to keep the private insurance framework, and the very slight differences between that principle and Obama's, in that Nixon's principle was to have make it a mandate for every employer to provide insurance, whereas Obama's mandate was that all of us have to buy insurance if our employer isn't doing it. And Ted Kennedy told me before he died, he said, "This was my biggest legislative error, was not taking this deal from Nixon especially, Nixon offered it twice in each of his 2 terms, and especially in 1973 when he was desperate for domestic support and offered it, but the Democrats looked at him and they said, he's so weak, we're going to get him out, a new president will come in, and with the new president we'll get Medicare for all, we'll get single payer." And it turned out to be Jimmy Carter, a conservative from Georgia, and the economy, inflation was raging, and Carter had promised a balanced budget, and so instead of getting national health care, you had a huge fight break out between Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. He challenges Jimmy Carter in the primaries in 1980, and Ronald Reagan is elected, and it heralds in this new conservative era. So Ted Kennedy knew he had missed his chance in 1973 by not taking Richard Nixon's proposal.
When he had an opportunity, but there were all these other things that Nixon managed to accomplish that would, by today's lights, certainly in the post-Reagan era or in our current era, would count as liberal programs, expansions of government power, provision of new rights, provision of new programs and benefits for people. Did he get any kind of satisfaction from that part of his legacy? Did he have any joy in it?
2 things. One is that he had been part of the World War II generation. And the World War II generation had seen a great crisis, 2 great crises, the Depression and then World War II, and had seen how muscular government can fix problems. So it was not like in the post-Reagan era where Bill Clinton says, the era of big government is over, or Reagan said, government is not the solution, government is the problem, to Nixon and to Dwight Eisenhower in particular, who Nixon served as vice president. There was nothing to be ashamed of or afraid of about government. If we needed for national defense to build highways across the country connecting every state capital, we would just do it. That was the way that Dwight Eisenhower thought, because when he had to invade Normandy and bring down Adolf Hitler. It was, oh, do we need 5,000 ships? Well, let's get 10,000 ships. Now, this was their thinking. So there was really no feeling that government was this great evil force in our lives in those days. The World War II generation felt differently. Nixon himself had certain things in the domestic side that he realized that he needed to do for the public. The environment is a prime example. He's elected, and 3 days later, we have the biggest oil spill in our history up to that time in Santa Barbara, California. And Nixon flies out there, and this is just as the environmental movement is kicking off. And Nixon has two choices. He can either go along with it, or he can resist it, and he sees it's vastly popular. He has a sort of a gut feeling that California is a beautiful place and we should keep it that way. And so you get this amazing tide of environmental measures. And it's in the book that at one point the major environmental organizations were polled and they were asked who was the best green president. And Teddy Roosevelt came in first and Richard Milhous Nixon came in second. So it's really a formidable record. But then there's other things that happened too. I once said that the subtitle to the book should be "And Yet," because as you read the book, you'll see that Nixon was the one who brought about the deliberate polarization of America on racial matters, the so-called Southern strategy. And yet, in the Nixon administration, there was more desegregation of Southern schools than in the Johnson administration, Eisenhower, and Kennedy administrations. His administration very quietly, prodded by the Supreme Court, but very quietly desegregated the Southern schools to the point that polls of Southern black voters in the 1970s gave Nixon like a 53 to 47 plurality. It was really appreciated. But Nixon didn't want the rest of the country to know about it because he had been so successful with the Southern strategy. So at the same time that he's quietly doing that, he's appointing people like Clement Haynsworth and Harold Carswell to the Supreme Court, guys that were really borderline, if not outright, racists. And then when they were defeated by Congress, making these impassioned stands that he was the only one who understood the South. So while he was doing one thing quietly, doing the right thing quietly, not wanting to let the South know that he was doing it, he would take these outrageous steps to make it look like he was against busing. He knew that there was this feeling of resentment that people had in the late 1960s, that white middle voters, the people that he called his great silent majority, and that he could tap it by telling them that, well, these minorities want it easy. They want to leap ahead of you in line. They don't want to do the hard work that you did. And he played that very successfully and really introduced that strain into American political life, and it's still with us today.
You know, the morbid fascination that Richard Nixon had with the media, and that to some degree comes to fruition with some of the things that he did in the Watergate larger conspiracy. You don't really start writing about Watergate or focusing on Watergate or using that term until the book is into the page numbers of 400s. Yeah. And maybe some people will be disappointed in that, but in another sense, you're actually explaining Watergate almost from the very beginning. You're talking about what it was in Richard Nixon that led him to his relationship with the media and then ultimately to Watergate. Talk a little bit about his early relationships with the media in Orange County, some of the little newspapers, and then, of course, the Los Angeles Times of the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah, there's a great irony that both Donald Trump and Richard Nixon are so anti-press because both of them were really creations of the press. And in Nixon's case, in Southern California, the Los Angeles Times was like the great elephant in the room. Really hardline conservative newspaper, and from the beginning took an interest in young Dick Nixon's career and promoted him, especially in the 1950 Senate race when he ran against a Congresswoman named Helen Gahagan Douglas.
The Pink Lady.
The Pink Lady.
Although he did not name her that. He did not call her that.
No, she was actually first maligned by her Democratic opponents in the in the primaries. And that's the kind of stuff that I was talking about. When you think about Nixon going in as a writer, you think about the 1950 race and you say, oh, horrible demagoguery. He was the one who called her the Pink Lady. Well, it was horrible demagoguery. By the last days of the election, he was literally accusing her of being treasonous and embracing Red China, which had just come across the border and joined the Korean War.
Because the Korean War had started during that campaign.
It started during that campaign. Mm-hmm. Where were we? What was that?
Well, we were talking about his relationship with the LA Times.
Oh, yeah, the Los Angeles Times. And same thing with Donald Trump. I mean, I grew up on Long Island. I spent a lot of time as a political reporter reading the Daily News, reading the New York Post, and seeing Donald Trump grow by manipulating the tabloid atmosphere in New York City. And then, of course, during the campaign, he was such a feature on the evening cable news that it is a great irony that both Nixon and Trump both identify the press as the enemy or the enemy of the people.
Now that's a parallel that I had hoped and thought you might well make. It carries on when they get to Washington, doesn't it? Because when Richard Nixon came east, first as a congressman, then a senator, vice president, he discovered a very different attitude in the media towards his career.
Yeah, definitely. He took down a series of liberal icons. And it is unavoidable that strong elements of the Eastern press were liberal. In Nixon's case in the 1950s, many of them were liberal Republican, but still liberal. And when he went after Earl Warren and he took down Alger Hiss, the spy in Harry Truman's State Department, and defeated Jerry Voorhis in his first campaign at Hellingham and Douglas, he was putting skins up on the wall that really marked him as a young, conservative, aggressive comer when he got to Washington. And the press indeed did. Some elements of the press did really a job on it. Drew Pearson, the great muckraker, picked him as a target. Herb Block, the cartoonist for the Washington Post in particular, would do these cartoons to the point that Nixon couldn't stand his daughters to read the morning paper, and so he canceled his morning Washington Post and got it at the office. So there was an element, definitely, that took that native paranoia within his spirit and accentuated it in Washington. But it was there from the beginning, because that first campaign, another little piece of the jigsaw puzzle that I found was that Nixon loved to make lists. He would sit in an armchair, put his feet up with a yellow legal pad all the way through, even through his presidency, and just write out lists and thoughts on yellow legal pads. And one of these I found was one of the first ones when he came back from the war and he was running for Congress, a complete unknown. And there, one of the things to do is like, okay, go to the Rotary meeting, stop by the local newspaper and buy an ad, set up a voter organization in such and such a neighborhood, put spies in the Voorhis camp. So there was something there from the very beginning that eventually grew and flourished and erupted in Watergate. But all along, he definitely had opposition from the liberal press that egged him on.
And he always believed, perhaps because of that early experience that he had had with individual publishers, editorialists, reporters, that every newspaper decided whether they were with you or against you, and that was it. Not just on the editorial page, not just in terms of endorsement, but in terms of how they covered you in the news. And
then he had some horrible misfortune. In 1960, he runs against the most charismatic candidate of the time, Jack Kennedy, who loved the press, who was a reporter, who could relate with the press, and there is absolutely no doubt in history that the 1960 press corps, the actual reporters, were sided with Kennedy. Nixon got more editorial endorsements, and Nixon who had used television so masterfully in the famous Checkers speech, was betrayed by his performance in the debates. So there were balancing factors in the media, but definitely the campaign reporters that he dealt with every day were very much pro-Kennedy, and there's really no doubt in history that this reinforced his idea that reporters were at least ideologically on the take.
Now, I want to give you all an opportunity to ask questions, so I'll just ask you one more as people come forward, and you can line up here at the microphones. We have one on either side if you'd like to ask a question. But let me just ask you, the name of Donald Trump has come up, and it's difficult to not draw parallels between these characters. Other people have done so, between the character of Richard Nixon, the character of Donald Trump. The media element is an obvious one. What else do you draw as a biographer and as a reporter? What else do you draw as lessons from this period when we come to our own era?
I don't think there's a lot of comparison between the two men. Nixon was definitely a foreign policy intellectual. He read and wrote books. He had a great, because he had served as Eisenhower's vice president, he had a great dignity and respect for the office, that it didn't blind him to commit the sins of Watergate, but still he would never treat it vulgarly. So in that regard, there's really not a lot of comparison between I don't see a lot of comparison between the two men. They both campaigned, and perhaps Trump took this from Nixon, with sort of this politics of grievance and resentment. And in fact, at times, Trump, when he was campaigning, even used the phrases that Nixon used. You know, it's going to be a law and order administration, and things like that. And the sins that Nixon was was charged with, and that have been alleged about President Trump, are very similar. You know, the Saturday night massacre in which Nixon fired the special prosecutor is compared very closely to Nixon firing the FBI, to Trump firing the FBI director who was leading the investigation into Nixon, and there's all this talk that perhaps Trump will fire today's special prosecutor. So it's more of a superficial resemblance, I think, than an actual one.
Thank you. And we will take your questions. Sir, first, this gentleman on the left.
Thank you very much. This concerns the 5 Watergate burglars. I had the pleasure this week of attending a continuing legal education program presented by John Dean. And he said very definitively, without any hesitation whatsoever, that if the 5 burglars had not been apprehended breaking into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate, they had another place to go that very evening. And that other place to go was McGovern headquarters, because people in the White House had expressed an interest in knowing what was going on there. And the point that he made is that while the break-in at the DNC did not emanate from the White House per se, the cover-up did, but not the DNC break-in, the subsequent break-in that never got a chance to happen at McGovern headquarters did emanate from certain individuals in the White House, and therefore, ironically, if the 5 guys had managed to make it to destination number 2, then the Watergate House of Cards might have come down sooner. Yeah. I'd very much appreciate your addressing that.
There are no questions anymore about Watergate. The tapes show Nixon talking to Bob Haldeman and saying, Bob, we need more wiretapping. You need to go out now and follow the Democratic candidates. And in this vast flood of paper that's been released in the last 30 or 40 years, you have evidence that it wasn't just McGovern headquarters, that they also, when Muskie was the front runner, they had opened up an office next to Muskie headquarters to serve as a listening post, and had gotten by putting spies in the Muskie camp, had gotten floor plans of Muskie showing where the different desks and telephones were. So this was almost every one of Nixon's aides at the White House had, with the exception of Henry Kissinger, had some sort of involvement in one of these dirty tricks. It was a massive, massive campaign. And indeed, as you say, it's a signal of what clowns Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt were, that they thought that they could break into the Democratic National Committee at 11 p.m. and burglar it and install bugs and take photographs, and then still be fresh enough and energetic enough that at 3 a.m. they would drive up to Capitol Hill to McGovern headquarters, which they had tried unsuccessfully to break into 3 times already, and successfully do it the same night. And they were doing it because Lydia and Hunt had blown all this money that they'd been given, and their bosses, Haldeman and Mitchell and others, were saying, you know, where's the fruits of what we're spending money on? And so they panicked, and they did incredibly stupid things throughout that whole episode. But Dean is right in that regard.
He also said that the motive for breaking into the McGovern headquarters was to see if the McGovern people had come across some of the information about the Ellsberg psychiatrist break-in, and they wanted to know if they were going to get hit with op-ed material from that.
I won't argue with him about that. I know that part of the motive for I think there were many motives for what they wanted. They basically wanted anything and everything. You can't just say, well, Watergate just happened because so-and-so wanted this particular piece of paper. There was lots of things that they were looking for.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Let's take one from over here.
So, well, I guess one of the strangest moments of a really strange presidency was in, I think, 1970, after the bombing of Cambodia, and he has this weird press conference, and he's staying up all night, calling like 50 different people, and he decides to go to the Lincoln Memorial and talk face-to-face with a bunch of student protesters. And I think it was in the Oliver Stone film, too, they kind of showed that as well. I was wondering, what did you take from that? What do you think Richard Nixon was looking for in that encounter? Why do you think he went at all?
I think the key to that encounter happens after he leaves the Lincoln Memorial and he goes up to the Capitol. And he's up at the Capitol and he tries to get into the Senate. He can't, it's locked, but he goes to the House of Representatives, and he has brought his valet because the whole purpose of this jaunt is to show Manolo the glories of Washington at night. And so he has him get up. Nixon sits in the chairs below, and he has Manolo get up on the dais and give a speech. And then as they're walking out and leaving, there's a cleaning lady, and she comes over and she's carrying her Bible, and she says, "Hi, Mr. President." I can't remember whether she asks him to sign the Bible or he just notices it, and he says, you read your Bible and you'll be a saint. My mother was a saint. And Nixon's mother throughout his life was sort of his conscience. And she had died only, I think, 2 years before he finally won the presidency. And throughout that night, there's references in his ramblings about his mom and how, and you can make sort of the psychological argument that he was very concerned about the fact that she would not approve of him expanding the war in the way that he did into Cambodia, that the death of the 4 students at Kent State would be something that she would really object to, and that he was expressing not only tension but also some small bit of guilt and shame about his mom. That's at least the way that I've always interpreted that remark. My mother was a saint, you be a saint too.
Let's see if we can get to a couple more over here.
Perhaps it would have been better if Richard Nixon never become president, but given that he did, I've always believed that it would have been better for Nixon, for the Republican Party, and for the country if he had won in 1960 rather than 1968. Is that a sentiment that you share or not?
Nixon was amazing in that all 3 times he ran for president, he ran as the more moderate candidate in the race. He was more moderate than JFK, he was more moderate than George Wallace and later Hubert Humphrey, and he certainly was more moderate than George McGovern in 1972. So he always represented sort of the staid center. And if he had gotten elected in 1960, I don't know how he would have handled Cuba. It's awful hard to play those hands out in retrospect. I know that he would have supported the Bay of Pigs invasion. He always claimed that he never would have let it go on in a half-assed way the way Kennedy did. It would have been a full-scale invasion the way that Ike invaded Normandy. So, you still might have had the missiles of October, but they might have been the missiles of April 1961 instead if this provoked a superpower confrontation. But he definitely was a calmer man in 1960. Not a great candidate, lost that race for a reason, but came really close and actually believed that he had actually won it.
Thank you, sir.
So you had said that one of Nixon's most admirable traits was his resilience. So there were two great comebacks in his career. One was after losing the presidency in 1960, and then after Watergate, of course. How did he go about engineering these comebacks, and why did the American people largely accept them?
The first comeback, which is Pat Buchanan has written a book called The Greatest Comeback, and I would say that that's true. Maybe the greatest comeback in political history, to come back from 1960 to 68. In 1968, Americans, you can't believe the chaos that Americans had been in. And what they wanted was just some sort of semblance of normalcy. And so you find that even the most passionate liberal detractors of Richard Nixon, Norman Mailer, Hunter Thompson, were writing, Walter Lippmann, were writing on his behalf in the 68 campaign saying, here is a seasoned, steady hand that may be able to get us out of Vietnam. So I think that his ability to present himself as a moderate, as an experienced man, was what worked in 1960. I think that the second comeback is not terribly important. I don't think it will make much difference in history, but he really did show some of himself, for example, in the Frost-Nixon debates. He did. If you've seen the movie or the play, there's a moment where David Frost very dramatically takes his clipboard and throws it on the floor and says, you have to lay more of yourself bare here, otherwise you'll never forgive yourself. This is your opportunity. And he has that great moment where he says, yeah, I gave them the sword and they stuck it in and twisted it, and I would have done the same thing myself. So he was never a man to be underestimated. He had great raw political skills, and like I said, that tremendous resilience.
Thank you for your question. Sir, we just have time for a few more.
Yeah, a couple of questions. The day Richard Nixon died on April 22nd, 94, when did you hear the news about it?
I don't know. I can't remember. Do you? Remember where you were?
I think I was home that evening. you know.
I was surprised. I thought he might live on longer. That's really a Brian Lamb C-SPAN question.
And I was wondering, did you read any of his 9 books?
I read very closely his memoir, and I think it's one of the best presidential memoirs. It's called R.N. It's very big and thick, and if anything, he goes too much into Watergate. You would think that he would gloss over it, but he really goes in. He wrote another book later in life called In the Arena, which was sort of a secondary memoir where he got some digs in at his enemies. But the one that I enjoyed the most, the two that I enjoyed the most were Six Crises, which was what he wrote after the 1960 loss, and then another book he wrote about great leaders that he had met when he was president. I think it's just called Leaders, if I remember correctly. So R.N., Six Crises, and Leaders would be the 3 that I would recommend.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Six Crises would certainly be part of that first comeback. Sir.
I'm not sure how much you discussed Gerald Ford in your book, but how would you compare and contrast Gerald Ford as Richard Nixon's VP at a time when everyone thought Nixon would be leaving office versus Mike Pence as Trump's VP while everyone wonders how long Trump is going to last? Was Ford as obsequious as Pence has been?
The vice president's job is a really tough job. And I've watched, I covered the White House. I was a political reporter for a time before I became a biographer. And you really have to feel for them. I don't think that Ford was too obsequious. In the last 6 months before Nixon's resignation, he was sending signals. In one of them, very famously, at the time when Nixon was under fire, he went out and he played golf with Tip O'Neill at a golf tournament in Massachusetts, and allowed the photographer, and Tip O'Neill was orchestrating impeachment in the House, and allowed the photographers to take a picture of Ford with his arm around tip. And in the last 3 or 4 weeks, he distanced himself, did not fall on the sword with Nixon. I hesitate to make any comparisons to Trump and Pence because we're not at that same moment of crisis and drama.
I think we may just be able to take one more question. Thank you, sir, for your question. Yes.
Yes. What do you think would have happened in the '68 election if George Wallace was not a factor, didn't run?
I think that in the end, the number of blue-collar votes that Wallace took from Humphrey was less than the number of votes that he took from Nixon in the border states. And so if he had not run, that would have meant that Nixon would have taken those border states, and Humphrey ended up taking those northern states anyway. So I think probably Nixon would have won no matter what.
And
his message was not that different from Wallace's.
And the Deep South, the states that voted for Wallace.
The Deep South had gone to Goldwater in 1964, so the solid Democratic South had been broken up already.
So the one chance that Humphrey might have had was having Wallace in there to
I think
possibly
so.
throw it into the House of Representatives.
Yeah, I mean the big threat to Humphrey was that these blue-collar workers in Ohio and Illinois and Michigan were going to go for Wallace, and in the end they did not.
Mm-hmm. I hate to cut off the questions, but we do have to give up the room, as they say. Thank you all. We want to thank the National Book Festival, Library of Congress, and C-SPAN. Thank you to C-SPAN for having us on tonight. And thank you, Jack Farrell.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.